Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project here and your moderator today. Our program, as you know, is entitled The Republican Revolution at 10, and the subtitle poses the question, Lasting Legacy or Faded Vision? In the interest of full disclosure, I should point out that in the 4 years prior to the Republican takeover, I was the Republican staff director of the House Rules Committee, and then for the first 2 years of the Republican control, I was the chief of staff of the House Rules Committee, so I have some knowledge and experience with today's topic, but I will try and remain your moderator. It was 10 years ago, precisely January 4th, 1995, that the 104th Congress convened under new management. For the first time in 40 years, both houses of Congress were controlled by Republican majorities. If revolution, by definition, is a sudden, radical, or complete change, or the complete overthrow of the established government and the substitution of another by the governed, then the electoral upheaval against the Congress in 1994 certainly qualifies as a political revolution against that branch of government. The American voters effectively overthrew the long-standing Democratic Party regime in Congress and installed in its place a controlling Republican majority. In the House, Republicans picked up 52 seats, giving them a 230 to 205 margin of control. In the process, they managed to defeat 34 incumbent Democrats, including House Speaker Tom Foley and 2 committee chairmen. In the Senate, in the meantime, not one sitting Republican was defeated in that election in the House. In the Senate, Republicans picked up 8 seats, giving them a 52 to 48 member edge. The House, though, is probably considered the more revolutionary of the 2 chambers that turned over in that historic election under the leadership of Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey, soon to be Speaker and Majority Leader of the House. The Republicans even published their own revolutionary manifesto called The Contract with America, and we've made copies of that available to you on the front table along with our other handout material. The contract, as you may recall, was signed on the Capitol steps on September 27th of 1994 by 364 House Republican members and candidates, Republican candidates for the House. And it not only spelled out the Republican criticism of the ruling Democratic Party, but also Republican principles and laid out a legislative agenda that the Republicans promised to bring to a vote in the House during the first 100 days of control if they won the elections in 1994. It included such poll-tested favorites as a balanced budget, constitutional amendment, a legislative line-item veto for the president, term limits for House and Senate members, anti-crime and pro-defense measures, welfare reform, tax cuts, and more. Moreover, the contract promised to reform the House on the opening day of the new Congress by adopting such measures as reducing the number of committees and cutting committee staff by 1/3. Abolishing proxy voting, placing term limits on committee chairmen, conducting the first independent audit of House finances, and opening most committee meetings to the public, and finally requiring a 3/5 vote on income tax increases. In short, the Republicans were promising not only to change the nation's policy agenda, but to change the way that Congress does business. As Newt Gingrich told an outside group on November 11th, 1994 in a speech, if this degenerates after an historic election into the usual baloney of politics in Washington and pettiness in Washington, then the American people, I believe, will move towards a third party in a massive way. And he went on, I think they are fed up with the city, they are fed up with the games, and they are fed up with petty partisanship. Well, to Gingrich's credit, no third party has since emerged. So I think to that extent you can consider the revolution a success. Another measure of success is the fact that in 5 successive elections, Republicans retained control of the House of Representatives, the first time that has been done since the 1920s. On the other hand, many Washington observers would argue that there is still the same baloney of politics, the same games, the same petty partisanship as there was before the takeover. The Capitol may have changed players, priorities, preferences, and allied interest groups, they argue, but the game is the same. The rules are basically the same. And if anything, there's just a lot more unnecessary roughness. To help us answer the question of whether there is any lasting legacy of the Republican Revolution or whether it is simply a faded rose of days gone by, we have for your listening and viewing pleasure today some of the best experts on what happened back in '95 and also what has happened since, both as direct players and people who have observed, written, and studied Congress in the interim. We'll first hear from the architect of the revolution of the contract with America, Newt Gingrich, who was elected House Speaker on the heels of that historic election in 1994 and served for 2 terms in that post. Today, Newt is chairman of the Gingrich Group as well as a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He is author of the just-released book, Winning the Future, a 21st Century Contract with America. Newt was first elected to the House in 1978, and by 1989 he had risen to the position of Republican whip when Dick Cheney left the House to become the Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush. Our second speaker today will be Vic Fazio, who currently is the co-managing partner of Clark & Weinstock here in Washington. Like Newt, he was first elected to the House in 1978, was soon a member of the powerful Appropriations Committee, and even one of its subcommittee chairman called, up there they call them the Cardinals. So he was a Cardinal, I think, either the first or second term that he joined that committee. He is one of several leadership posts, or he took one of several leadership posts over the course of his career on the Hill, starting as Democratic campaign chairman. Then from 1989 to 1994, he was the chairman or vice chairman of the, or I'm sorry, before that, he was a vice chairman of the Democratic caucus, and then from 1995 till his retirement, he was chairman of the Democratic caucus in the House. He's known as an institutionalist, having co-chaired, for instance, the Leadership Task Force on Ethics in 1989, which I was privileged to serve on as a minority staff member. He was also the chairman of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee and referred to at the time as sort of the mayor of Capitol Hill because of their control and the purse strings over Capitol Hill. We won't ask him today of his views on the cost overruns of what we call the Big Dig up there, the Visitor Center, but that is coming along, if not on schedule. He cut his eye teeth in California as a, first of all, as a journalist, co-founding the California Journal, which I assume is sort of a combination of Congressional Quarterly here and National Journal, and then he became an aide to the governor and then a state legislator in his own right. Our third speaker will be Sarah Binder, who is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. She's also a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Sarah is author of the book Minority Rights, Majority Rule, Partisanship and the Development of Congress. And I think this may have been an extension of her PhD dissertation, but it's an excellent study that tells about the attitude of both the minorities in Congress and majorities towards change, congressional reform, and so on. I just would highly recommend that book. Sarah's also published a book, I think, in 2003, more recently, on stalemate, causes and consequences of legislative gridlock. Finally, we'll hear from Janet Hook, who is the congressional correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. Janet got her start in journalism as an assistant editor with the Public Interest and then with the Chronicle of Higher Education. From 1983 to 1995, she was a senior staff writer for the prestigious Congressional Quarterly, during which time she won the Everett Dirksen Award for the best reporting on Congress in 1992. She's also won the 2002 award from the American Political Science Association for political reporting. When each of our panelists has finished making their presentations, what we'll do is mix it up among the panel a little bit, and then we will open it up to our audience for questions. You are all welcome to a reception that will take place immediately outside the auditorium following today's roundtable. So with that, I will turn things over to Newt Gingrich.
Thank you, Don. I think the timing of this discussion could hardly be better. I noticed that I think it's the New Republic described Democrats looking for Newt Gingrich in a contract with America, and then I think The Economist magazine had a column by Lexington talking about how the Democrats need to do all this. And I think it's useful to go back and look at what is this thing we're looking at and how do you contextualize it and what actually happened. And it's kind of mildly ironic, but let me just say to any of you who are true aficionados, the kind of person who, turns off television so you can read really obscure documents. The Ethics Committee actually printed over 1,000 pages of our planning documents. So they're public property. And so what I'm going to tell you is stuff you can actually go back and look, because it really irritated some of our opponents at the time. Because, in fact, we laid out what we were going to do. We did what we laid out, and it turned out to work. And I want to start with that as a background to what we're going to talk about, because I think behind any large, complex activity, you ultimately have to have a theory of what you're doing. Not a theory in some abstract sense, but a theory in the sense that a chef has a theory of a souffle, or that a bridge builder has a theory of bridges, or an airplane builder has a theory of airplanes. And we started out with a couple of theoretical propositions. One was is to be found best stated in a novel by Gene Burdick called The Ninth Wave, which is a terrific study of Samuel Yorty's politics in California in the mid-1950s. And Burdick essentially tries to draw the parallel between surfing and politics in the age of television, and argues that you get a wave effect, and that successful political leaders ride waves, and in a sense, I would argue that is almost exactly the pattern you've seen now for some 40 years. If you want to see the pattern writ large, I would recommend strongly The Right Nation by two Englishmen, Wooldridge and Micklethwaite, who are writers for The Economist magazine. The Right Nation is their effort, which came out in midsummer, to explain to Europeans the emerging nature of American politics. And the shorthand is pretty simple. We are recovering from the Cultural Revolution and the counterculture, and the Civil Rights Movement, and the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the memory of the Depression. And as those things all fade, we are drifting back towards being a center-right country. As they put it, Clinton survived by governing as an Eisenhower Republican, and in their judgment, it was not that decisive whether Kerry won or lost, because he would either govern as an Eisenhower Republican or he would shatter his party. It's a very interesting book by outsiders, and it's useful to read to give you a flavor of what our assumptions were, because our assumptions were very similar to that. We had and this was a long cycle. I first started studying Ronald Reagan in October of 1964, when he made his speech to the national speech during the Goldwater campaign. As a graduate student, I studied him carefully when he ran for governor. When I ran for Congress the first time, I actually had the opportunity to spend an hour with him talking about his speech style and his famous index cards, and how he thought about a speech and what he was trying to accomplish. And I don't think you can understand the rise of the modern Republican Party unless you go back to Reagan and this very unique intersection between an FDR Democrat, a dislike of high taxes, a passionate anti-communism, and an entire career embedded in television, radio, and movies. And so Reagan happened to personify a set of skills that other people could learn. And much of what happened after the 1970s is a function of Jack Kemp's enormously passionate impulse to make the Republican Party a party of optimism, and a party of ideas, and a party of tax cutting for the purpose of economic growth, and then Ronald Reagan's extraordinary ability to articulate the values of the American people. We assumed that there'd be cycles. If you had asked me at the time, I would have said we had 3 to 5 years from the time we won in November of '94. And I think we got basically about 3 years of real change, culminating in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. We had some significant changes, of which probably the most structural were welfare reform, the Thomas system to open up the House process so anybody in the world can access information without having to go through a lobbyist or a trade association, and capping committee chairmen. The underlying system wasn't changed. I think it's important to recognize as a realist that the constitutional structure of dispersed power has enormous longevity and is likely to continue to be so for a very long time, and that the House and Senate have remarkably different objective requirements. The House ultimately requires fairly strong leadership, and there's a reason why, for all practical purposes, from the rise of Thomas Reed in the 1880s to the present, almost all the really effective periods of House activity have had strong speakerships. And there I would commend to you Dick and Lynn Cheney's marvelous book, Kings of the Hill, which is the best short introduction to that kind of leadership. The other part of it is that there are cycles, there are two parallel cycles that may or may not intersect. One is cycles of political change. When does a country get fed up enough to sort of lunge forward and coerce the city to change? The other is a cycle of ideas. They don't necessarily connect. You can have political change in terms of who has power without having idea change. What made '94 different was you had both of them happening simultaneously. And the reason that could happen is that we stood on Ronald Reagan's shoulders. So, for example, Reagan first proposed welfare reform in September of 1970. It was a marginally winning argument until the publication of Losing Ground in, I think, 1983 or 1984, which really began to change the whole debate, because the Losing Ground makes the argument that keeping people in dependency and passivity actually destroys the person you're trying to help. That was compounded by Marvin Olasky's remarkable book, The Tragedy of American Compassion. And so we were both politically ripe and intellectually ripe for welfare reform by the 95-96 cycle. And so I start with the notion that I look for two kind of waves. When does the country want to move, and how can you, to some extent, facilitate that wave? But in many ways, it's really a wave that is historic, not political, and politicians ride it. I think in that sense, Burdick's analogy is a pretty good one. And the second is, can you nurture an idea wave so that when you acquire power, you can actually do something with it? And it's the combination of the two that is peculiarly difficult and complex. Just one or two other points I want to make as a general introduction, and then I think we'll have a lot more fun having a dialogue. It's really important to understand that had the Democrats in the House and Senate listened to Clinton in the campaign of '92, there's a fair chance they would have remained in power. Because Clinton in the campaigned as a center-right politician. It's, at least mythically, it's the dinner they have in Little Rock, where the Democratic leadership convinces him not to make Jimmy Carter's mistake and try to govern against the Democratic Congress. And so he comes in with tax increases, and he has a whole series of proposals which are way out of proportion with getting 43 or 44% of the vote. I mean, had he come in and governed as the way he governed after '95, he in fact probably would have preempted us from getting to be a majority. But coming in and governing on the left was kind of the last straw. And I say this for two reasons. One is it's technically true. The other is it's one of the greatest challenges the Democrats have today in trying to study us, because most of what we did was simply move to a center-right majority, which resonated to what we were talking about. And in particular, it was the collapse of the Democratic Party in rural and small-town America, which is the biggest single indicator of the '94 election. If you go back and look, where were the really big gains? They were all in places that were rural and small-town. And it was partly a values election, and there, I would suggest to you Zell Miller's autobiography is actually very, very apt as an introduction to why you have now a Republican majority. I'll just say one other, or two other large things. We handed out today our core document on vision, strategies, projects, and tasks, and our leadership model of listen, learn, help, and lead. If you've never done it, it is amazing how hard it is to get 350 plus congressional candidates to agree to a contract. Remember, this is not a platform. A platform says, we believe in this, which means with the day after you get elected, you can say, and I still believe in it, but not this year. This was very consciously designed as a management tool. This was a contract. It said, if you elect us, we will vote on the following in the first 100 days, and we actually had written the legislation. So we had done every single thing a good consultant would tell you not to do. We were absolutely leading with our chin, but we had one ace in our pocket, and that was every issue was 70% or better with the American people. So we were quite cheerful about debating the issues. We went through a 6-month training program. Every one of our candidates understood the issues. We got all but 3 of the incumbents to sign the contract. And this was not a new thing. If you go back and read David Broder in, I believe, October of 1980 or September of 1980, the first Capital Steps event is actually, because I helped organize it, when I'm a freshman in 1980 with Reagan and Bush, and I believe that it actually was the margin by which we won the Senate in 1980. The second time we did it was 1994. But by 1994, we'd had 14 years of practice. We knew much more about how to train the candidates, how to train the press secretaries, how to orchestrate the issue development. And if you look at the actual contract, it is a remarkable document because it's totally positive. It violates every rule of challenger politics as consultants teach it. It was a totally positive document because we thought the Perot voters had to see something positive or they wouldn't turn out to vote. And that was the core of our gamble, that we had to be positive so the Perot voters would vote because the Perot voters hated negative politics. And if we had run a negative campaign, in my judgment, we'd have gained 30 seats but not gained control of the House. So that's a sweeping background, and I appreciate very much the chance to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Very good. Mr. Fazio?
Don, thank you very much for including me. I particularly appreciated your mentioning your staff work for our bipartisan ethics panel in '89. I think Newt was a member of that as well. And it was perhaps one of the last truly bipartisan things Congress did. And I think it stands the test of time even today. I'm very pleased to be here to discuss the contract for purposes of discussion. I won't use On America, which was so typical of my colleagues on the Democratic side, the contract with America, and to be with Newt Gingrich, who is clearly one of the great political field commanders in modern American politics. You've just heard him describe the training that his folks went through, the effort that they made to bring people behind this unifying document that was designed to nationalize the election. And it worked. There's no question that very few people in America knew what the contract was all about. I don't think it was that important, frankly, that they did. What it did provide was Republicans running for office with common themes that allowed them to nationalize that election. And it also provided not the new leader of the Republicans, but the Speaker of the House, with a document upon which they could begin to do their work. It was in the context of the election that Karl Rove has just helped create a prime example, maybe one of the first examples of base building. It was really to energize the Republican base, and I think it had a tremendous amount of success in that regard. It also caught the attention of the press. I think the press, while it's always been typified as part of the left, as the Speaker would say, truly believed, I think, that the 40 years of the House Democratic majority had probably gone on too long. And there was almost, I think, an empathy with the desire to bring about change. That was, frankly, good news copy. It was something they enjoyed writing about, and it fed into the document that you all have, I guess, in front of you. It's fair to say at the time the Democrats were, I won't say their worst enemy, but they certainly weren't operating in the most effective way. We were institutionally finding it very hard to deal with the structural changes that needed to take place. The House Bank closed too late. There were committee chairs who cared more about their turf and their committee's jurisdiction than they did perhaps about providing a record that Democrats could run on. You remember we failed to pass the health care plan, which in retrospect probably should have been deferred in the first two Clinton years. We should have done welfare reform first and shown the country that we knew how to govern and understood where they were coming from. But it's also fair to say that much of what we lost over in that election year of '94 had to do with the courage to proceed on a number of issues. The Balanced Budget Act that we passed in '93, in conjunction with the one that had been passed with President George H.W. Bush's cooperation in 91 and the one that was agreed to in 97, all really came together in providing the incredibly good economic times of the 90s, record low interest rates, and an effective deficit reduction package. But included in that was a 4.3 cent increase in the gas tax. It could easily have been a half-cent increase in the corporate tax, and we could have avoided that direct hit that we took in the election, raising taxes on all Americans, we were said to have done. Strangely, that 4.3 cents has never been repealed. It wasn't part, I guess, of the contract or any subsequent party proposal. But if you read the preamble to the contract, you see the phrase, to restore accountability to Congress, to end its cycle of scandal and disgrace, and to make us all proud again of the way free people govern themselves. That was the Republican culmination of their reform efforts that Don has documented in his paper that went back many years in terms of changing the way the House of Representatives functions, and at the same time taking advantage of the very effectively orchestrated effort on the part of the Republicans in Congress to focus on the corruption in Washington. Newt comes from a background of very effectively exploiting these kinds of issues. He ran against John Flint, the chairman of the Ethics Committee, in 2 prior elections, and it was his threat to run a third time that caused Flint to retire. I have a sense that he wouldn't have been elected had he run, but Newt Gingrich came to Washington understanding the ability to go beyond the normal issues that divided the 2 parties and try to galvanize a reformist instinct, bringing about a change in the way Congress functioned. The first time I saw Newt really performing in Congress was in the debate over the late Charles Diggs of Michigan and the ethics problems he had. And I wondered, why would Newt Gingrich, freshman member, be in the middle of this fray? And then I learned the background that had been part of his political ascendancy. And later on, the Gang of Seven and others that were put together out of the 94 class of freshmen really understood how to keep, I guess they came actually earlier than that, really came to understand how they could make the fat and out-of-shape 40-year Democratic majority need replacement. I think if you look, however, at what's actually been accomplished with the contract and where we are today looking back, not a lot can be said to have been permanent change. In fact, I would argue the circumstances in the House today are far worse than the Democrats ever imposed on the Republicans, even when they were most threatened in the early 90s. We were, first of all, in the contract, required to apply the rest of the laws the country had to deal with on Congress itself. And duly, we created a small little adjudicatory body in the legislative branch to do that. It was hardly noticed for most of the last 10 years. I noted recently House leaders have actually gone to court to limit the authority of that entity. We were supposed to conduct an audit of Congress, and we did in a sense in the first 2 years of the Republican majority. But frankly, even the creation of an inspector general, which was another cause advocated by Tom Ridge, for example, has proven to be of really minimal value. I mean, there may be some periodic fine-tuning the institution makes in every Congress, and that's all to the benefit. But now most of the reports are kept secret. We now have a terrorist threat, so it's a very convenient thing to keep them from getting into the hands of the press, which was so aggressive in seeking this inspector general role. We talk about the need to cut the number of House committees. I think that has grown once again after the initial cut. We did cut the staff. That's grown again after the initial reduction. And events occur. Homeland security needs and other things do eventually come to bear. I think I give Newt tremendous credit, though, for having actually been willing to enter into the thicket of changing congressional jurisdictions. The Commerce Committee a fine example. Much of this power has now been diffused to financial services and other places in the Congress, evening out the workload and actually giving more people, certainly in the majority party, a role in the political process and the legislative affairs. Casting of proxy votes in committee, yes, we did fix that abuse, but we're now, as I understand it, Don, beginning to backslide even a little bit on that original long-term Republican goal. Requiring committee meetings to be open to the public, well, I guess it depends on what you define as a committee meeting, because while there are probably a number of open meetings on the Hill, the important ones aren't. Conference committees often are meeting not only without the minority's participation, but certainly without the public's knowledge of what's being discussed in those meetings. I think we've never seen a time when secrecy was more dominant than it is today. I'm not putting all of this at Newt Gingrich's feet. I think we've seen in the last 6 years changes that have run against the grain of this contract in very clear and dramatic ways. We did not require tax increases to have a more difficult time getting through. We frankly have not let that impede Congress in doing whatever it wished to do in these days. Certainly the balanced budget proposal came a cropper in the Senate, but it certainly would be a complication that the majority party now in control in Washington doesn't necessarily need or really want. So I think we've done a great deal to revert back, in fact, beyond what any Democratic Congress and any chair ever did in their desire to control affairs, to a time in which the public's participation in the Congress, let alone the members of Congress themselves, are extremely limited. We have ample examples of bills coming to the floor with little notice, people not knowing what's in them. We had that recently occur on the appropriations omnibus, where a grant of authority was given to staff of the Appropriations Committee to find individual tax returns available to them, something that nobody on the committee seemed to know had been included. We had this discovery after the fact on the Medicare pharmaceutical bill that passed in the last Congress as to the what real value cost of the bill was. That information was kept from the members when they voted, because I think they knew the bill would have gone down to defeat. The Congress currently is led by people who have taken the lead from the contract to further entrench power in the leadership at the cost of vastly weakening the committee structure and the role of individual members within the legislative process. There's no question that today leaders decide not only what bills will come up, their long-term constitutional authority, but what will actually be heard on the floor. The Rules Committee has more power than it ever did under Judge Smith before the reforms that were put in place to give the authority to the leadership to have some say over what really came to the floor. Today, the Rules Committee is often drafting the last version of the legislation, coming to the floor with a package that many of the members of the committees of jurisdiction who've already heard the bills and voted on them and marked them up, they're not even fully apprised of what comes out of the rules process. The leadership operates in a way that has been strengthened by the term limits that was originally supposed to limit authority of the committee chairs. Today, the leadership determines whether you get an extension or not. If you were a good team member, you maybe get another 2 or maybe 4 years. Certainly the limits on the Speaker have been extended. So it's all about the power of the steering committee, the leadership in the House particularly, deciding without much opportunity for dissent what should come to the floor and be voted on in what form. Now on the ethics issues, I think there's no question that the ethics process has broken down almost beyond repair. In the Jim Wright investigation, which Newt instituted leading up to the '94 election victory, The committee operated in a truly bipartisan way. Not all of the charges that were levied proved to be the case, proved to be true, but the special counsel found other areas of concern, and Jim Wright, in hoping to expatiate the process of vilifying leaders, decided to leave Congress and hoped that peace would follow. Of course, unfortunately, it hasn't, and there have been attacks against leaders on both sides ever since. The committee's been unable, frankly, except in some relatively minor areas, to do much more than admonish anyone, and to do it only because I think of the courage of a few individuals, Joel Heffley, for example, of Colorado, who recently has shown a good deal of willingness to deal with some of these issues in a bipartisan way. Unfortunately, we now have made it impossible for anyone to bring a complaint to the committee who is not a member. We've admonished those who have when they were deemed to be politically motivated, as if almost all of the ethics campaigns in the 80s and early 90s weren't politically motivated. But there's a certain element of hypocrisy, it seems to me, in how a process which was so useful in giving Republicans the impetus they needed to take control has been totally eviscerated while they were in charge. It's sometimes astonishing. I came to be a real fan of a fellow named George Nethercutt, who was elected to Congress on the term limits crusade, defeating Tom Foley in 1994. But when 6 years later it was time for George to decide whether to break his commitment to term limits or run again, he did run again using exactly the same language that he was so critical of when Tom Foley talked about what he could do as Speaker of the House for the people of Eastern Washington. It's almost sometimes mind-boggling that people don't understand the words that they're now using to defend their actions are so at odds with the words that they used when they were selling their new leadership and the concept of the contract. Now, there were a number of early accomplishments. Newt's ticked off some of them. I think during his tenure, welfare reform and that third leg of the balanced budget effort were very important ones. There are also some other things that have not stood the test of time. The Telecommunications Act, which has been eviscerated at the FCC and is really well overdue for renewal. Freedom to farm. You remember how we were getting out of the farm programs? That was something that has been thrown out and replaced with more federal assistance to agriculture than ever occurred, probably in proportionate terms back to the New Deal. So, any leadership can make a difference for only a while. It seems to me Newt was, as I said, a great field commander. As a legislative leader who had to work the very difficult issues with the administration, with the minority party, which has been continually frustrated in its lessened role, and in the most conservative members, many of them legacies from that 94 victory class with this huge influx of Republicans. It was a very difficult balancing act to keep all those people in place. Obviously, they can debate the effect of shutting down the U.S. government during Newt's reign. Some people think it actually helped them hold the House 2 years later. Others believe that it was the beginning of not only the end of his speakership, but that of a Republican leadership in Congress that could really, fairly allow issues to be resolved. I think they have concluded, I'm not sure Newt would have, that absolute control is the only way to preserve the majority. And all of the transgressions on the kinds of values that the contract purported to be interested in, all those modern, recent transgressions, I think really are a reflection of much more than the fact that the margin of majority in the House is so close. It is a mindset that allows the leadership to, in effect, put all other values behind the one value of maintaining power. That's what the K Street strategy is about. Putting people downtown to make sure you have people to feed back in the requisite resources to make sure the majority can perpetuate itself. It's not so much about ideology, it's about the retention of power. And so I think the contract, while it was an idealistic document in some ways, was also a fairly cynical document, trying to take advantage of a mood in the country that they had helped create, and that is to make change based on the fact that the Congress had become remote, corrupt, unresponsive. I'm not sure that today you could say much differently about this Congress than some said about the Congress in 1994. But I do know that we are going to have to go back to work on this process because I think many Republicans now are feeling very much that they are victimized by it as well. And when that sort of movement is created within the Republican conference, just as there were restive members of the Democratic caucus in the early 90s, change is inevitable. So I look forward to the dialogue too. I hope I have in some way gotten some things out of my system that I've had there for these 10 years. You know, I was in charge of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee when we took this monumental loss. So I must say my objectivity has always been called into question. But I do feel that the Congress has, in some ways, and I hope to hear more from the press and the academics in this regard, come more than full circle. And it's time for a change once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sarah Bender?
Great. Well, thanks very much for including me. It's an honor to be here. It's nice of you to bring both books there. Last I checked on Amazon, I think Newt's book was ranked about 45th, and mine was ranked about 200th or 245,000th.
They're way
or
about the same.
300,000, so don't rush out and buy mine. Don asked me to share some observations about how partisan and political dynamics over the past decade of Republican rule have affected the House in its development as an institution. So my comments are more about process than about policy per se. I thought I'd give an assessment generally of what's changed and what's not changed from my perspective, and then give some consideration to why this pattern or these patterns may have emerged. And my basic observations, I'm not sure possibly could get me in trouble with my former leader on the left as well as the former leader on my right, so I'll try to stay right in the middle here. My basic observation is that despite all the change that Republican majorities have brought to the House over the past decade, my sense is that perhaps ironically, not all that much has changed about the way the House operates as a political institution. I'll have some caveats at the end about that conclusion that I'll come to in a moment, but my sense is that the House remains fundamentally a partisan political body, the basic outlines of which were put into place under Democratic majorities over the second half, say, of their 40-year reign. Although even as an historical aside, even those changes under Democrats were conditioned on landmark institutional changes adopted by Republican majorities at the end of the 19th century that Newt Gingrich referred to under Speaker Reed. That is, institutional changes put into place well over a century ago that today allow political parties to centralize control in the leadership. What do I mean by this partisan political body or political institution? Essentially, the House is a body that responds to the policy and electoral demands of the majority party. The rules of the game give the majority party leadership the ability to control the agenda, assuming the existence of a reasonably cohesive majority behind it. Leadership today essentially sets the agenda, largely shapes the set of choices that legislators are allowed to vote on the floor, and leadership is generally able to marshal support for those policy positions advanced on the floor. These are political powers that are facilitated by the standing rules of the House, previous question motion, privileges of the Rules Committee, use of restrictive rules, and so on. What I think is important to recognize is that these institutional powers existed and were exploited by majority parties well before Republicans took control of the House in '95. One might say they are as much the tactics of Tip O'Neill, Jim Wright, and Tom Foley as they are of Newt Gingrich and Denny Hastert. In fact, it's the Democrats' exercise of these powers that stimulated much of the reform agendas and efforts within the Republican conference in the 80s and early 90s, and as Don points out in his essay, that became the basis for the contract with America in '94. If you look at what Republicans were saying before '94 and what Democrats are saying after '94, there's quite a lot in common. Both minority parties complained, or today complain, of severe limitations on the ability of minority party members to participate in the legislative process. And at times you'll hear Republicans say, gee, we better be careful here, we are getting as bad as the Democrats were. Now, a lot of folks might hear this and say, you're nuts. There's something fundamentally different about the House today in 10 years after 94 than before, not least on account of the size of the majority party. Many folks say there's something different, fundamentally different about legislating under small majorities, and that much of the House dynamics today is driven by the difficulty of sustaining a governing majority. The Rules Committee Chair, David Dreyer, in recent weeks has said, look, Democrats had at time margins of 80 or 90 majority party members, but look at the margins that I've had to deal with. I tend to disagree. I think that much of the legislative House process looks the same, right? And Dreyer has also said that, look, my first priority is moving the Republican agenda. My second priority is making sure that it's done in as fair a way as possible. What does that entail? An assertive rules committee stacked in the favor of the majority leadership, use of restrictive rules to limit votes on minority and bipartisan alternatives, adoption of rules that reflect the majority, as Hastert would say. But again, I don't think that's much different than what we saw exercised on the House floor through the House Rules Committee before the Republicans took over in 94, where bills by and large reflected the views of the Democratic majority. Small margins may be making things dicey for the Republicans, puts a premium on their organization, but I don't see a fundamental change in the legislative process because of the slim majorities. Now, that's not to say that nothing has changed. There are at least two aspects of change I think worth dwelling on. First, there does appear to have been a ratcheting up by Republicans of their use of these tools of agenda control that they inherited from the Democrats. Clearly, that's visible in Don's data in his essay on restrictive rules, self-executing rules, increase in suspension motions, probably in the increased use or waiving of the 3-day layover rule, too. And it may be that these are differences of degree rather than kind, but clearly that makes them no less real or worrisome to the minority, as Vic Fazio has pointed out. The second area of change is there's clearly been an infusion of partisanship, or rather partisan agenda control, into the committee system. And that is, I think, somewhat fundamentally different than the legislative process under the Democrats. We can see this in a number of ways. First, the restructuring of the steering committee within the Republican Party to advantage party leaders, and particularly the Speaker, in selecting committee chairs and committee members. We have what one of my GW colleagues calls musical chairs, that is, moving beyond the standard rule of seniority to look at party loyalty, often in financial terms, in the decisions of selecting chairs. The steering committee's selection of House Appropriation Committee subcommittee chairs, we used to call them cardinals. We might need a new choice of birds type to describe their powers. That's a fundamental change also in the way parties have, or party leadership has influence over the operations of that committee. Perhaps most important, as others have alluded to here, term limits on committee chairs and subcommittee chairs. I do think that has altered political life within the Republican conference, created an exceedingly important avenue for the leadership to extend its reach into many of the policy decisions or policy choices of the committees. We're also now seeing the reach of partisanship, or an effort by the parties to structure the agenda, into the work of the House Appropriations Committee, which until the last year or so I think has really resisted this push toward partisan agenda control, and is clearly exemplified by the selection of the new chair, not according to leadership, not according to seniority. We've also seen this reach of partisanship into the process in the Ethics Committee, as Vic Fazio pointed out. Have these changes broken the back of the committee system as we knew it under Democratic majorities? I'm not sure we're entirely there yet. This is clearly most visible on questions of jurisdiction, or the turf of committees, and efforts to change jurisdictions. In 95, when David Dreyer proposed some fundamental restructuring of committee jurisdictions, at least that was one of his proposals, but then he backed away from that. And again, we've seen some efforts to restructure committees with the advent of the Homeland Security Committee. But again, we've seen pretty much a resistance to fundamentally changing jurisdictional lines within the House. My sense is that term limits on chairs has not really changed the incentives that chairs have to protect their remaining committee powers, which is essentially defined by their turf. So why do we see this pattern? Why this continuity, albeit with some ratcheting up by Republicans in recent years? In my work on minority rights, I tried to show that the short-term goals of parties really shape their views about the rules of the game. It's not really long-term goals that shape them, or some sense of reciprocity with minorities, but immediate short-term policy goals of majorities tend to dictate what types of rules they will seek to use. When majorities are cohesive and they encounter obstructive minorities, they tend to restrict the rights of the minority party, and that's historically. That's not just a story of the last 10, 20 years. When majority parties weaken and cross-party coalitions are more likely to emerge, those are the conditions historically when majority control is loosened and minority rights are expanded. Clearly, with the polarization of the two political parties, we shouldn't have seen any expansion of minority rights. We should not be seeing, according to that logic, more opportunities for offering amendments, fewer suspensions, and so forth. The conditions that encourage minority participation or the expansion of minority participation, they just haven't been in place since probably the early 1970s. At the same time, neither of Republican majorities really had a hard time getting what they want. Minority party simply doesn't have the tools it needs to influence the choices made by the House in any systematic way. There are exceptions. Clearly, the House discharge rule was used to good effect, for instance, on campaign finance reform over the last few years. But again, here the exceptions probably prove the rule that Republicans, through their domination of the Rules Committee and their reasonably cohesive majority, can get their favored bills passed without much challenge from the minority party. So again, and I should say that even when Republicans haven't been entirely united on policy goals or policy grounds, as in the debate over Medicare expansion in 2003, it looks like the party's electoral goals may be sufficient to get recalcitrant Republicans to line up behind the goals of the majority party on the floor. So even though we've seen innovations at the margins, it seems to me that the underlying dynamic remains the same in the House, and that is, even after 10 years, even after the parties have continued to polarize, even after Republican majorities until November have shrunk, even after the Senate has changed hands twice, and even as unified Republican control of Congress and the White House seems to be coming a new norm. So in reflecting on the question Don asked me here, I've been really struck by the staying power of these old ways of doing business that were inherited by Republican majorities, and yet how easily they've been adopted or adapted to the Republicans' policy goals, which everyone has noted are quite different than the goals of the Democratic Party before them. I'll stop right there.
Okay, thank you very much. Finally, Janet Hook.
Thanks, Don, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Don actually asked me to talk a little bit about what it was like as a reporter to be covering the 1994 transfer of power. And it actually coincided with right around the time that I was hired. I used to work at Congressional Quarterly, and right around the time that he became Speaker, the LA Times hired me. And just in case you have any notion that there's a meritocracy in journalism, I'll tell you this. In October 1994, I was having an interview with the LA Times over lunch, and they said, "So, you think the Republicans are going to take control of Congress?" And I said, "No way." And they went ahead and they hired me anyway. So much for great political punditry. But the period of 1995-96 was probably one of the most interesting periods of my whole career of covering Congress. And it's not for very deep reasons. I mean, journalists love change. I mean, it's practically the definition of news. And there never has been, at any other time in my career, such dramatic change on the Hill. And to understand how much that meant to me and other reporters, you have to consider the day-to-day life of a congressional correspondent. The Congress usually moves extremely slowly, extremely incrementally. There are a lot of anonymous people, the same faces, very few changes year after year. So after the 1994 election, there were new issues, a whole new agenda, stuff that we haven't covered 6 times over the last 6 years. There were a whole new cast of characters, and the freshmen actually meant something. They were important characters, and not just the backbenchers that you ignored until they became committee chairman. There were new ideas, and then there was Newt. Newt was a great sort of news event unto himself. And it was very different because when you cover the White House, you know, there's the president. You cover the president. When you cover Congress, there are all these different people. But after the Republicans won control of Congress, it was hard to not pay attention to the Speaker. And probably one of the things that I remember very clearly from that period that sort of encapsulated what a difference it meant was the institution of the Speaker's press conference. Now, there had been Speaker's press conferences every day that the House was in session before the Republicans took control. Vic, do you think, did Sam Rayburn do some version of this? But not, I don't know. I know Tip O'Neill used to have these little pen and pad briefings. They'd bring a bunch of reporters into the ceremonial Speaker's office just before the House came into session, and Tip would just be there with a bunch of old reporters and say, well, today we're going to do the suspension calendar, blah, 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 blah. No cameras, no big pronouncements, no big ideas, just what we're going to do today. And then when Speaker Wright was in office, it was a little bit more mixed up because of all of the controversy that he went through with his ethics investigation. But then when Speaker Gingrich took charge, this became a very important forum for him to deliver messages, make pronouncements on the issues of the day, and answer our questions. And it was just, they had to move it to a bigger room, they had cameras in, and it just got to be, a kind of a way of hearing from the congressional leadership that we just didn't, it's just different. Now, after a while, I think the Speaker had said enough things, gotten into enough controversies that they kind of cut back on these press conferences, and we were very sorry. Now, Speaker Hastert has kind of taken us a little bit back to the Tip O'Neill approach of, today we're going to do suspension calendar, mumble, mumble, mumble. And so some things were enduring changes with the contract and with the Republicans taking power. That was not one of them. One institutional change that also had a big impact on reporters, I think, is the degree to which the Republicans, and Speaker Gingrich in particular, centralized power in the hands of the leadership, because as a reporter, you get your information from people who have power. They know what's going to happen or what isn't going to happen, how it's going to happen, to the extent that you want to go to one source. It used to be on tax bills, you just had to go to Dan Rostenkowski. Or if you wanted to know something about an energy and commerce bill, if you didn't talk to John Dingell, you couldn't possibly know what was really going to happen. And I think, committee chairmen are still very important and have independent views in their own right. But I think right now the Republican leadership is much more the locus both of information, decision-making, knowledge, and for reporters, information. Sarah and others have talked a lot about the sort of internal impact of the changes in the 94. And I agree with the sense that somehow they're coming around full circle with some of the problems that they complained about with the Democrats. But I think the more interesting question, just sort of from my kind of policy point of view, is just where the 94 class and the Republican control has and has not had an enduring influence on policy. Though I will say on one area of internal change, I am really astonished that the term limits on committee chairmen have remained in effect. Because, when one reform after another gets either brushed aside or ignored, I thought for sure that would be one of them because committee chairmen have so much power. But the fact is there are a lot of people who have an interest in turnover in committee chairmanship, and only the 12 or 13 or however many committee chairmen who would want it to be repealed. But anyway, so that was a genuine change, and I think it may not affect their willingness to defend their turf and their institution, but it really does get new blood at the top of committees, and I think that's something that probably won't change. I wonder what would happen if the Democrats came back in power. But Speaker Gingrich mentioned three of the areas that he saw as lasting changes, and I think they're all kind of telling. One was the institution of Thomas, and that actually was a great thing that I use almost every day. But it also has happened that over the last 10 years, there's been lots of other sources of information over the internet. So it was probably more important when it happened than it is today. Welfare reform. Now, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, when they debated it in 1985-86, it really was huge, tumultuous policy debate, big shift in power. And while the Congress hasn't really gotten around to reauthorizing it, there isn't much of a sense that anybody's thinking about a dramatic change in the direction of that policy. That really was a lasting change. In other entitlements, the success hasn't been quite as pronounced or the more striking thing is the way some of the aspirations to rein in entitlements have been reversed. As Vic mentioned, they had a big change in the farm programs that was essentially undone 6-8 years later, and and the expectation of farm aid has continued as high as I think before 1994. And Medicare, of course, after the Republicans got so much flack for their efforts to restrain the growth of the program in the early years after they took control, they participated in the biggest expansion of Medicare since its inception, with the prescription drug benefit being added. So you have this sense of kind of a mixed legacy policy-wise. And I think the one that I'm most intrigued by is the the kind of change in the character of the Republican Party and its ideology, because the class of 1994 really was elected on a platform of small government and limiting spending and shrinking government. They had this metaphor for what they wanted to do with the budget was they didn't want to just cut spending, they wanted to pull up programs by their roots. So you didn't want to just trim the grass, you wanted to pull it up by its roots so that the programs would be abolished rather than just cut back to economize. And you just don't hear that much talk about that anymore, maybe just because they found that some of those programs they actually kind of liked when they were the ones who were spending the money on it. But also, I think the events of 9/11 really kind of dropped a big factor into the calculation of whether, it's sort of like now the debate is no longer big government versus small government among Republicans. It's what kind of government are we going to have? And it's a bigger government now than when they first came to power, but it's also not the kind of government that Democrats would have built. It's much more heavily skewed to defense and homeland security, and I think we'll probably see in the next 2 years a little bit more of the shifting of spending priorities if Bush, in fact, gets serious about trying to reduce the deficit and cut spending. Well, with that, why don't we turn to questions?
Okay. Well, let's first of all, I'd like to give Newt a chance to follow up as well as Vic on what is said since they spoke, and then we can maybe ask a couple of questions and then open things to the audience.
I don't know that I have much to. Yeah, I think this has been a helpful overview, and I mostly agree with it.
Let me, Vic, do you have anything to follow up?
Well, I just wanted to take something away from what Janet has just been saying. I do think Newt has personally and appropriately taken a share of the credit for the balanced budgets that emerged. But the record in recent years is abysmal. We have no pay-go system in place, which I think was a very important element of bringing the Republican Congress and President Clinton.
Explain what pay-go is.
Pay-go means that if you want a new program or a new tax cut, you've got to pay for it in some manner, either by raising another tax or cutting another program. And Republicans have been unwilling to reinstitute that once it lapsed. But you see, this Congress that in '94 was focused on rooting out whole departments and spending in general, putting 3,400 line item, some would say pork barrel amendments in conferences, which are controlled by the leadership of both the House and the Senate, Republicans largely, in most cases only. In the days when we used to actually go through all 13 appropriation bills individually, I'm not sure all of this would have been, frankly, acceptable to the average member. We're now governing in a way that has totally eviscerated the appropriations and budget process. We don't even pass budget resolutions anymore if it's inconvenient. When members don't want to make the cuts in the appropriations bills that are not popular but need to be made, we don't make them make those cuts. We amalgamate all the bills, we pass them at the last minute, and no one has any knowledge not only of what's in them, but how we got to the numbers that were mandated by perhaps the OMB. It's a total breakdown of the traditional budget process, and the Appropriations Committee has suffered greatly as a result of this, and it's, in my view, driven largely by a desire to, at all costs, shield members from the political consequences of making votes that might be unpopular with somebody. Well, the Democrats were held to a much higher standard for a long time and paid a price for it, but it was part of the price of democracy. It was part of the price of actually fulfilling our constitutional obligations to be the source of spending. I'm very troubled by the situation we face now. I'm wondering whether there'll be some desire to reform that by the committee, let alone by the rank and file on the Republican side, who ultimately have the authority to bring about not a reaction or a return to normalcy, but at least a process that's clear, that's accountable, that gives the public a role in deciding how we're going to spend our money.
Can I comment about that?
Yes.
Because this is a comment on the future rather than 10 years ago. I essentially agree with Vic. And I think it'll be fascinating. One of the reasons that people who really get into politics and government find it so difficult to take up anything else that has quite the same attractiveness intellectually is that it is so complicated and it is so beyond your ability to project, so that you end up with twists and turns you can't quite anticipate. You know, George W. Bush runs as governor of Texas to be a very limited commitment overseas, focus on domestic policies. I'm really going to be Mr. Domestic Policy President. September 11th occurs, and the following 3 years he spends it almost entirely as Commander-in-Chief in national security. So I just start with this. I'll make two predictions, one of which I talked about in Winning the Future in a way that I suspect will be a little bit of a surprise to some members of the Republican leadership. It's my view that the Senate is too loose and the House is too tight. That on the one hand, Frist as majority leader has to have a slightly, not dramatically, but slightly greater ability to get something actually decided in the Senate, because the Senate now runs itself largely by exhaustion. But that at the same time, the House leadership is making an enormous strategic mistake if they stay too tight. And the reason it's a big mistake, not a small mistake, is that the great virtue of allowing amendments is that you surface problems early and you begin to notice that the world is different than you think it is. One of the things that happened to the Democrats in the 80s was they began to have committees that were stacked so that the liberals could always win. And the problem that posed for them was they would then report a bill out of committee they couldn't sustain on the floor, because the committee was actually to the left of the House. It was appropriate for the Democratic caucus, but it was to the left of the House.